Calvin Mercer didn't shake her hand. He didn't even look at her face. He slid the contract across his mahogany desk like he was discarding a losing poker card, tapped it once with one manicured finger, and said, without glancing up, "Sign it. You'll be on the morning train to Montana. Consider yourself placed." Evelyn Ashford stared at the paper. Her father's debt. Her family's name. 3 generations of Ashford pride reduced to a single line on a document that would ship her west like furniture nobody wanted anymore. "You arranged this marriage," she said quietly. "You chose him." Mercer finally looked up, and he smiled. "I chose him because he will fail. And when he does, that valley becomes mine." If someone used you as a weapon against a man they wanted destroyed, what would you do? If you enjoy powerful stories about survival, betrayal, and women who refuse to stay broken, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment telling me your city and country. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this one moves you, hit that like button. It means more than you know. Now settle in. This story is just getting started. The morning Evelyn Ashford boarded the westbound train, she carried one trunk, $11, and a last name that no longer meant anything to anyone who mattered. She had worn her best traveling dress, deep burgundy wool, brass buttons down the front, collar pressed flat the way her mother had always insisted. Old habit. She smoothed the skirt before sitting down in the train car and then caught herself doing it and stopped because there was nobody left to impress and she was tired of performing composure she didn't feel. The other passengers didn't notice her. A farmer with mud still on his boots, 2 women traveling together who talked in low voices and occasionally laughed, a young man in a too large jacket reading a newspaper with his lips moving slightly. None of them knew they were sitting beside a woman who had just been sold. That was the only word for it, even if the documents used softer language. Arranged placement, contractual matrimonial agreement, mutual benefit. Calvin Mercer had written the terms himself. Evelyn's father had signed them 6 weeks before his heart gave out, probably already knowing what he'd done, probably telling himself it was the only option, probably dying with that particular kind of shame that men carry when they've traded something precious to cover something foolish. She didn't hate her father. That surprised her sometimes. She thought she would. The anger was certainly there, buried somewhere under the layers of practical thinking she'd forced herself to adopt. But hatred required energy she couldn't spare. What she felt toward Calvin Mercer was different. That hadn't softened at all. She had met him 4 times. The first time, she was 16 and he was a dinner guest at their home in Newport. A tall man with silver temples, and the kind of smile that showed all his teeth without reaching anywhere near his eyes. She remembered thinking he laughed too quickly at everything her father said, and that something about that bothered her even then. The second time, she was 23, and he was a business associate her father was negotiating with. She served tea. He didn't acknowledge her presence, except to wave his cup in her direction when it needed refilling, the way you signal a waiter. The third time, she was 26, and the Ashford family finances had quietly, catastrophically collapsed. Mercer came to the house with 2 lawyers. He was kind about it in the way that only people who know they've won can afford to be kind. The fourth time was the morning she signed the contract. He had laid out the terms with the patient efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this conversation and knew exactly how it ended. The debt would be forgiven, all of it. The accumulated wreckage of bad investments and worse advice and one genuinely terrible season in the shipping trade, if Evelyn agreed to travel to Harlan County, Montana, and marry a rancher named Silas Boone. He needs a wife to satisfy the county settlement requirements, Mercer had explained, folding his hands on the desk. Single men can't hold the Eastern Valley land. It's an old ordinance. He's been fighting it for 2 years. "And you want me to marry him," Evelyn said. "I want the county to see a married couple on that property by the 1st of October. She had looked at him steadily. "What aren't you telling me?" Something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly, more like appreciation that she'd asked. "The ranch is remote. The conditions are difficult. Many women have attempted frontier life and found it," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "incompatible with their constitutions." "You think I'll quit?" "I think," Mercer said slowly, that a woman of your particular background will find Montana clarifying. It wasn't until she was already on the train, already past Providence, already watching the landscape flatten and roughen and lose its familiar manicured edges, that she turned his last sentence over fully in her mind and understood what he'd actually meant. He wasn't helping Silas Boone get a wife. He was sending Silas Boone a liability. If Evelyn failed, fled, collapsed, refused to stay, the marriage would dissolve, the settlement requirement would go unmet, and the Eastern Valley would revert to county control, which Mercer had already quietly arranged to purchase at the lowest possible rate. The debt forgiveness wasn't generosity. It was the cost of a very specific kind of sabotage. She sat with that understanding for somewhere around 300 miles. Then she opened her trunk, took out the small journal she'd kept since she was a girl, and wrote exactly 4 words on a blank page. He underestimated me. Good. She closed the journal, put it back, looked out the window at a landscape that was becoming wilder by the hour, rockier, colder, indifferent to the existence of anyone passing through it. She felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, closer to fury with direction. Silas Boone was not a man who thought much about what other people expected of him, mostly because in 34 years of living in Harlan County, very few people's expectations had ever served him well. He'd built the ranch from a single cabin and a leased pasture, expanded it over 8 years of work that had cost him 3 broken fingers, 1 badly set shoulder that still ached in cold weather, 2 good horses, and 1 very decent friendship that had ended badly over a disputed fence line. He was not proud of the fence situation in retrospect. He'd been angrier then. He tried to remember that about himself when he was judging other people's tempers. He had agreed to the mail order arrangement because the county ordinance was real, the deadline was real, and he was running out of options. His neighbor, Hester Clamp, who was 70 years old and claimed to have outlasted 3 husbands through sheer stubbornness, had told him point blank that if he didn't find a wife before October, he might as well start digging a hole for his own ambitions. The county doesn't care what you've built, Hester had said, sitting in his kitchen eating his cornbread without apology. They care about the paper. A single man holding that much land in the Eastern Valley makes the board nervous. Always has. That's absurd, Silas said. Most of the law is absurd. Doesn't stop it from ruining people. He'd agreed to the agency's terms partly out of desperation and partly because the alternative, courting someone locally, required a kind of sustained social effort he was genuinely bad at. He was not warm upon first meeting. He knew this. He was not charming. He forgot to ask questions. He said what he thought before he thought about whether thinking it was useful. He had expected someone practical, a widow, maybe. Someone who'd already survived hard things and came without illusions about what frontier life required. What arrived at Harlan Station on a Tuesday afternoon in late September was a woman in a burgundy wool dress with her chin lifted at an angle that suggested she had opinions about everything she was looking at and was choosing, very deliberately, not to share any of them yet. Silas stood on the platform with his hat in his hands. Hester had told him that was the polite thing, to take the hat off. Don't just stand there looking like a post. And he watched Evelyn Ashford step off that train and look at the town around her with an expression that was not quite disgust, and not quite despair, but something in between that she was working hard to keep off her face and mostly failing. She was thinner than he'd pictured. She had a specific kind of posture that came from years of being told how to hold herself. Straight, controlled, not a single degree of slump allowed. There were shadows under her eyes. Her hands, when she finally shook his, were cold. "Mr. Boone," she said. "Miss Ashford." That was the full extent of their introduction. He took her trunk. She followed him to the wagon. He helped her up without being asked, because the step was high and the ground was muddy, and he wasn't going to watch her struggle just to prove a point about independence. She didn't say thank you, and he didn't expect her to. They rode for 2 hours without talking. The silence was not comfortable. It was the specific silence of 2 strangers who have both decided that saying the wrong thing right now would be worse than saying nothing, and so they are saying nothing, and both of them know it, and neither of them is going to mention it. About 40 minutes from the ranch, Evelyn said, "How many head of cattle?" 112. Acres? 460. Another 120 if the settlement holds. A pause. What's the water situation? He looked at her sideways. Creek runs good through late spring. Summer gets tight. We haul from the upper tank July through September. How far is the upper tank? Mile and a half up. She nodded. He couldn't read anything in her expression. What's the settlement requirement exactly? She asked. The marriage ordinance. He hesitated. There was a way to answer this that was polite and a way that was accurate. He went with accurate. Married couple, both present on the property, verified by county inspector. October 15th. If we don't meet it, I lose the Eastern Valley claim. What happens to the Eastern Valley then? Gets sold at county auction. And who's positioned to buy it? He looked at her again, more directly this time. Calvin Mercer. She didn't flinch. She didn't react at all. She just said, yes, the way you confirm something you already knew, and then she turned back to watching the road, and he drove the rest of the way to the ranch in a silence that felt, very slightly, less hostile than the one before. The cabin was smaller than she'd prepared herself to accept. She had prepared herself for small. This was smaller than that. One main room, a sleeping loft, a wood stove that took up almost a quarter of the floor space, a table with 2 chairs that didn't match, one window facing east that let in a pale, grudging light in the mornings, shelves along the wall holding an assortment of supplies organized with a rough practicality that suggested nobody had ever asked whether they were convenient, only whether they existed. Silas set her trunk down near the wall. Loft's yours, he said. I'll take the floor. That seems unnecessary, she said. It's a small loft. I'm aware of what a loft looks like. There's one blanket up there, he said, ignoring what she'd implied, which was probably wise. I'll get another from the barn. You keep blankets in the barn? I keep a lot of things in the barn. He left. She stood in the middle of the room and looked around her with the specific stillness of someone cataloging damage and refusing to let the catalog overwhelm them. The floor needed sweeping. The stove needed cleaning. There was old ash crusted around the grate. The one window was so dirty it was functioning more as a smear than a transparent surface. There was a bucket near the door that had been there long enough to leave a ring on the floor. The table had a crack down the middle sealed with something dark she didn't want to examine. She took off her travel coat and hung it on the hook by the door. She found a broom in the corner and she started sweeping. She was halfway through the floor when Silas came back with the blanket and found her. He stopped in the doorway. You don't have to do that. I'm aware, she said, and kept sweeping. He watched her for a moment. She could feel it, the particular quality of attention that meant someone was reassessing something they'd already decided. She didn't look up. Supper's my job, he said finally. I cook. All right. You look like you haven't eaten. She paused. The observation was so blunt it landed somewhere between rude and honest, and she wasn't entirely sure which side it came down on. I ate this morning. That was this morning. She went back to sweeping. Then I suppose we should be grateful one of us knows how to cook. He made a sound that might have been a laugh, a short, surprised exhale like he hadn't expected to, and then he went to the stove and started building a fire and didn't say anything else for a while. That night she ate salt pork and beans and cornbread that was slightly scorched on the bottom, and it was the best meal she'd had in 3 months, and she told him so. He looked at her like he wasn't sure if she was mocking him. She wasn't. 2 days in, Hester Clamp appeared on the porch like she'd materialized from the cold air itself, carrying a covered pot and looking at Evelyn with the frank, unhurried assessment of someone who has earned the right to stare directly at people. So, Hester said, you're the one. Apparently, Evelyn said. I heard you were fancy. I heard you outlasted 3 husbands. Hester smiled slowly. You're not what I expected. Neither is this, Evelyn said, gesturing vaguely at everything. Hester came inside without being invited, set the pot on the stove, and sat down at the cracked table as though she'd been sitting at it for years. She might have been. Evelyn made tea because it was something to do with her hands, and because the morning had already required chopping her own kindling, discovering that the water bucket had a slow leak and burning her thumb on the stove grate. She needed something familiar. Mercer, Hester said without preamble. You know what he's up to? Evelyn set a cup in front of her. I know exactly what he's up to. Does Silas? Silas knows the man wants the valley. I'm not sure he knows the full shape of how he intends to get it. Hester wrapped both hands around her cup. The full shape, she repeated. That's a careful way to say something. I'm a careful woman. Are you? It wasn't a question. Hester studied her over the rim of the cup. What are you going to do? Evelyn looked out the east window. She'd cleaned it yesterday, just that one pane so she could see the ridgeline in the mornings. I'm going to stay, she said. I'm going to make the inspection, and then I'm going to make sure Calvin Mercer never touches this valley. That's a large plan for a woman who burned herself on her own stove grate. It was the second morning, Evelyn said evenly. I won't do it again. Hester looked at her for a long, level moment. Then she drank her tea. No, she said, with something that sounded almost like approval. I don't think you will. By the end of the first week, Evelyn's hands had blisters she hadn't known were possible. Not the small, neat blisters of someone who'd overworked at a garden party. Real ones, deep and hot, across her palms and the insides of her fingers, from hauling water and splitting kindling and scrubbing cast iron and doing things she had absolutely no framework for except watching and adjusting and refusing to stop. She didn't complain, not once, partly because complaining wouldn't change the blisters, partly because she knew Silas was watching for the moment she'd break. Not cruelly, not with satisfaction, but with the wary resignation of a man who had already decided she would leave and was simply waiting for the timing. She was going to make him wrong about that. The fifth day, she was hauling the second water bucket up from the creek, twice daily, every day, a mile-round trip that was going to be longer once the ground froze, when she slipped on a wet rock and went down hard on one knee. The bucket went over. The water soaked into the ground, and she sat there for a moment in the mud, knee throbbing, bucket empty, and felt the full absurdity of her situation press down on her like a physical weight. Newport, dinner parties, a piano she'd played every evening, a cook named Mrs. Ferris who made proper stock and never let anyone see the kitchen unless it was immaculate. She picked up the bucket, went back to the creek, filled it again, carried it home. Silas saw her knee when she came in, the torn fabric, the mud, and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, wet rocks. Yes, she said, step sideways of the flat ones. They hold the most water. She looked at him. All right. You should wrap your hands tonight. There's cloth in the left drawer. She found the cloth. She wrapped her hands. She did not thank him in words, but she filed every piece of information he gave her like it was currency, because out here it functioned exactly like that. Knowledge kept you standing. Ignorance put you on the ground. She was learning, faster than she looked like she was. She needed Silas not to notice how much she didn't know yet. She needed him to keep giving her these small pieces of practical education like he was commenting on the weather, casually, without the weight of a lesson attached. She thought she was managing it, mostly. On the seventh night after supper, he looked across the table at her and said, "Why did you really come?" She met his eyes. "You know why. I know what the contract says. I'm asking why you actually came." The fire in the stove cracked and shifted. Outside, the wind had started picking up. She was already learning to track the sound of it, what the different pitches meant. "Because," she said carefully, "refusing would have left me with nothing. And I decided I would rather bet on myself in a hard place than surrender to a man who was counting on me to disappear." Silas looked at her for a long time. The lamp between them made his face hard to read, all shadow and flicker. "Mercer set this up," he said. Not a question this time. "Yes." "He picked you because he thought you'd leave." "Yes." "Will you?" She held his gaze. "No." He nodded. Once. Short and definitive, the way he did most things. Then he got up and took his plate to the wash basin and said, without turning around, "Inspections in 31 days. I know. There's a lot to do before then. I know that too." He didn't say anything else. But that night, when she climbed to the loft and pulled the blanket around her against the cold that came through the walls like it had a personal grievance, she lay awake listening to the wind and thought that something had shifted. Barely. but shifted. He wasn't waiting for her to leave anymore. He was starting to calculate the possibility that she wouldn't. That was enough. For now, that was enough. Ambatum. On the 12th day, a rider came to the property. She saw him from the window, single horse, moving with a confident slowness that meant he wasn't here to pass through. Silas was out at the north fence and wouldn't see him for another hour at least. The rider stopped in the yard. He had a wide-brimmed hat and a coat that was too clean for a working man, and he looked at the cabin with an expression she recognized because she'd seen it on Calvin Mercer's face every time he'd looked at something he'd already decided he owned. He didn't dismount. He called toward the cabin. "Mrs. Boone?" She came to the door. She didn't open it all the way. "That's me," she said. Not because it was fully true yet. They were married on paper. The ceremony had been 4 minutes in a railroad magistrate's office in Miles City, but because it was the truest available thing. "Mr. Mercer sends his regards," the man said pleasantly. "He wanted to know how you're settling in." "Tell Mr. Mercer I'm settled just fine." The man smiled. He had small eyes. "He also wanted me to remind you that the return arrangement remains open. If you find the conditions here unsuitable, transportation back to the East Coast has already been arranged and paid for. No obligation." She looked at him. She looked at the horse. She looked at the too clean coat and the too pleasant smile and the whole careful architecture of a message designed to sound like generosity while meaning something entirely different. "Tell Mr. Mercer," she said, "that I have no intention of returning anywhere." The smile stayed, but something behind it shifted. "The winters here are severe." "I expect so." "The work is—" He paused, looking her over in a way that made her want to close the door on his sentence. "Considerable, for someone of your background." "Are you finished?" she said. "A beat." "Mr. Mercer only wants—" "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "wants this ranch. He's been clear about that since the beginning. You can go back and tell him that the woman he sent here to fail has found the arrangement entirely to her satisfaction." She closed the door. She stood with her back against it and breathed through the shaking in her hands. Because her hands were shaking, they were shaking badly, and she hated that, hated the way her body advertised fear she had decided not to feel. Until it passed. Then she went back to the stove and checked the beans and reminded herself that the rider was already turning out of the yard, and that what she'd said was true, and that the shaking would stop if she gave it a minute. And it did. When Silas came in that evening and she told him about the rider, he was quiet for a long time. "What exactly did you say to him?" he asked. She told him. He was quiet again. Then, "That was either very brave or very stupid." "It might have been both," she admitted. He looked at the floor, he looked at his hands, then he said, "You know what happens next, right? When you tell Mercer that you're not going to run? He sends something worse than a messenger." "Yeah," Silas said. "He does." The wind outside had picked up again. She could hear the cattle in the far pasture shifting, the distant low sound they made when the temperature dropped fast. "All right," she said. "Then we'd better be ready." He looked at her across the cabin, this small, difficult, freezing room that smelled like wood smoke and damp and the particular mineral sharpness of a place that didn't care one way or another whether you survived in it. And something in his expression changed. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but something like recognition, like he was seeing her clearly for the first time and discovering that what he saw was unexpected and maybe, very cautiously, not unwelcome. He didn't say anything about it. He put more wood on the fire, and she finished the supper, and the night came down hard and cold over the valley. And inside the small cabin, two people who had arrived as strangers were becoming something else. Not quickly, not easily, not without the slow and painful friction of two very different people learning to occupy the same space, but becoming it nonetheless. And somewhere outside the county, Calvin Mercer was already planning what came next. 3 days after the rider left, Silas found a section of the north fence cut clean through. Not broken, not weather damage. Cut with something sharp in 4 separate places spaced far enough apart that the cattle had already drifted through the gap sometime in the night. He stood looking at it in the early morning with his jaw set and his hands at his sides, and that particular stillness he had when he was angry, but not yet ready to say anything about it. and Evelyn stood beside him because she'd followed him out when she saw his face at breakfast, and she looked at the cut wire and understood immediately what it meant. "How many head got through?" she asked. "Don't know yet. Need to count." "I'll take the east side." He looked at her. "You don't know the east pasture. Then tell me the boundaries and I'll learn it this morning." He told her. She went. She spent 3 hours in cold she was still not used to, walking ground that was uneven and deceptive under a thin frost, calling to cattle who had absolutely no interest in being counted by a stranger, and demonstrated this by moving away from her at exactly the pace required to stay just out of a clear count. She lost the tally twice, started over, found a group of 8 that had pushed into a hollow she almost missed entirely. When she came back, she had a number. Silas had a number from the west side. Together, they were missing 11 head. "They went north," Silas said, reading the ground in a way she was still learning to understand. The compressed frost, the direction of the marks, something about the angle of disturbed grass. "Into the ridge country." "Can we get them back before dark?" "We're going to try." They spent the rest of the day doing that. It was not graceful. It was cold and loud, and involved a significant amount of Silas shouting things at cattle that the cattle ignored, and Evelyn making mistakes she corrected faster each time, and both of them coming back at dusk with 10 of the 11 animals, and a collective exhaustion that had passed beyond the point of conversation. The 11th steer came back on its own 2 days later, looking put out about the whole experience. Silas repaired the fence. He didn't say it was Mercer's men. He didn't have to. That night, Evelyn wrote 3 pages in her journal, not about the cattle or the fence, but about the specific mechanics of how Mercer operated. The patience of it, the layers, the way each move was designed to look like misfortune rather than malice. She'd watched him work this way in business her whole life. She knew the pattern. What she was still figuring out was how to interrupt it. She fell asleep with the journal still open and woke up with ink on her cheek and the stove already going, which meant Silas had been up before her and had started the fire without waking her. And she didn't know what to do with that, so she simply washed her face and made coffee and decided not to mention it. He was already outside. She stood at the clean window with her cup and watched him in the early light doing something with the wagon harness, his breath visible in the cold air. His movements the unhurried efficiency of a man who has done the same task so many times, they've become part of his body rather than decisions. She thought about what he'd said 10 days ago. He does. When she'd predicted Mercer would escalate. The flatness of it. The acceptance. He'd been fighting this man for 2 years already, probably longer if you counted the quiet pressures that never left a mark. She thought, he's tired. Not visibly, not the way that showed. Silas Boone was not a man whose tiredness showed on the surface, but it was there underneath the efficiency. The specific weariness of someone who has been defending ground alone for so long that defense has become the entirety of what they know how to do. She set her cup down and went outside to help with the harness. He didn't say anything when she appeared. He just shifted slightly to give her room. She'd watched him do this 3 times now, and she was almost certain she had it. She did, mostly. One of the buckles gave her trouble, and he reached over without comment and adjusted it from the wrong side to the right one, his hands quick and certain, and she filed that away too. "I need to go to Harlan," she said. "What for?" "I want to talk to the county clerk about the inspection process. What exactly they're looking for, what documentation we need." He paused. "I know what they're looking for." "You know what they've told you they're looking for. Those aren't always the same thing." He looked at her over the horse's neck. "What do you mean?" "Mercer has money and relationships in this county," she said. "If he can't remove me physically, he may try to complicate the inspection on a technicality. I want to know what every requirement actually says, not what someone told you it says." Silas was quiet for a moment. She could see him adjusting something in his thinking. Not resisting exactly, more like a man who's been walking a path alone so long that having someone walk beside him requires a slight change of pace, and the change is uncomfortable even when it makes sense. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow." The road into Harlan took about 2 hours in the wagon, and Evelyn used the time to ask Silas things she should probably have asked 3 weeks ago, but hadn't, because 3 weeks ago she was still primarily focused on surviving each day without visible collapse. She asked about the specific history of the Eastern Valley claim, how he'd acquired it, what the legal basis was, whether the paperwork was filed locally or in the territorial capital. He answered in the short, factual way he had, and she listened and asked follow-up questions, and by the time Harlan's handful of buildings appeared in the distance, she had a clearer picture of the legal terrain than she'd had before. The county clerk's office was one room attached to the back of a building that also housed a dry goods store, and apparently a dentist, judging by the sound coming through the wall. The clerk was a small, neat man named Dorsey, with ink-stained fingers and the careful eyes of someone who has processed too much human desperation to be surprised by any of it. Evelyn introduced herself as Mrs. Boone and asked, very politely, to see the specific ordinance language relating to the settlement requirement. Dorsey hesitated, just slightly. "The ordinance," he repeated. "The exact text," she said. "Not a summary. The language is written." He found it. It took him longer than it should have, and she watched his expression while he looked, and she thought, he's been told something. He's been primed for this visit somehow. She didn't know how that was possible. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. And then she remembered the writer who'd come to the ranch and thought, Mercer has eyes in this town. Of course he does. He's been working this county for years. She read the ordinance carefully. Silas stood beside her with his arms folded and read it over her shoulder. Twice she went back to the beginning. The third time through, she found it. The residency language. Both parties to the marriage must demonstrate continuous habitation at the stated property address for no fewer than 30 days prior to the inspection date. 30 days? She said quietly. October 15th, Silas said, understanding exactly what she'd found. We have 22. When did I arrive? 23rd of September. She did the arithmetic. 15 days. Dorsey was very carefully looking at the wall. Mr. Dorsey, Evelyn said, if the 30-day requirement was not met, if someone arrived at the property later than 30 days before the inspection, would that invalidate the claim? Dorsey cleared his throat. Technically, the ordinance requires, does anyone verify the arrival date, she said, or does the inspector take the party's word for it? A pause. There's a registration process, a filing with this office when the bride arrives, by the hosting party. She looked at Silas. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything. Was a filing submitted, she asked, for the arrival of Evelyn Ashford at the Boone property? Dorsey opened a drawer, closed it, opened another. He pulled out a ledger and went through it with the slow, deliberate attention of a man who already knows what he's going to find and doesn't want to find it. No filing, he said. Which means, Evelyn said carefully, that as far as this office is concerned, no arrival date has been recorded, which means the date is currently unverified. Dorsey looked at her for the first time like he was seeing her as something other than a category. Mail-order wife, frontier novelty, temporary woman, and seeing something else instead. That would be an accurate reading, he said slowly, of the current status. And if a filing were submitted today, recording the arrival date as... She paused. The 23rd of September. That would be a legal document, Dorsey said. His voice was very careful. Filed with this office, with today's date as the filing date, but the arrival date as stated. Can we do that now? A long pause. Dorsey looked at his desk, at the ledger, at somewhere past both of them. I'll need both signatures, he said. They filed it. They walked out of the county clerk's office into the cold air of Harlan's main street, and Silas stopped on the step and looked at her with an expression that was almost something like startled. How did you know to look for that, he said. I've watched Calvin Mercer operate my entire life, she said. He always leaves a technical gap. It's how he works. He arranges something that looks inevitable but only becomes inevitable if you don't read the actual document. Your father didn't read the actual documents, Silas said. It wasn't cruel. It was just accurate, and she'd thought the same thing herself enough times that hearing it from someone else didn't land as hard as it might have. No, she said. He didn't. They bought supplies and drove home, and it wasn't until they were most of the way back that she realized she felt something she hadn't felt since before her father died, before the lawyers, before the mahogany desk and the contract and the train. She felt useful. Not in the grinding, exhausting, blistered way of the past 3 weeks, which had been useful the way survival is useful, necessary rather than fulfilling. This was different. This was the specific feeling of applying something she actually knew to a problem that actually mattered, and watching it work. She hadn't known she was missing that. She looked at the ridgeline and thought, 22 days. They could do 22 days. What she didn't know yet, what neither of them knew as they drove into the yard with the wagon and started unloading the supplies, was that Mercer had already moved past the fence wire and the messengers and the technical maneuvering. He was done trying to make Evelyn leave voluntarily. He'd decided to remove her by force. The men came on a Thursday. There were 4 of them, and they came in the middle of the afternoon when the light was flat, and Silas was out at the south pasture moving the second grazing rotation far enough from the cabin that he wouldn't hear anything that happened near the yard until it was already over. Evelyn was carrying a split log from the woodpile when she saw them ride in. She set the log down without hurrying, which was something she'd been working on, the impulse to freeze or rush when something alarmed her, and the deliberate effort to replace it with a kind of controlled stillness that she hoped read as more confident than she felt. 4 men. 3 of them hung back near the fence post. The 4th came forward. He was large and his coat was expensive in the way that said money without taste, and he looked at Evelyn with the particular patience of someone who expects to be obeyed. "Mrs. Boone," he said, not asking. "My name is Rankin. I represent Mr. Calvin Mercer. I have a document from Mr. Mercer's legal office indicating that due to—" "No," she said. He stopped. "I haven't finished. You were going to tell me there's a legal reason I need to come with you, or return to the east, or vacate this property, or some variation on one of those 3 things. The answer is no." Rankin looked at her for a moment. Behind him, one of the other men shifted in his saddle. "The document is not legitimate," she said. "Any document purporting to compel my removal from this property would need to come from the county court, not from a private legal office, and would need to be served by a county officer, not by 4 men on horseback who work for the man trying to take this ranch." Rankin's expression didn't change much, but something behind it did. He'd expected argument, maybe tears, maybe the particular fragmentation that happened when you frightened someone who didn't have a foundation under them. He hadn't expected this. "Mr. Mercer's concern," he said carefully, "is for your safety. This is not an appropriate environment for a woman," she said, "for someone of your background." "My background," she said, "is none of Mr. Mercer's business, and neither is my location." She turned and went inside the cabin. She was aware very precisely of the 4 sets of eyes on her back and the distance between the door and where she was standing and whether the door was going to be enough. She got to the wall beside the door. She took Silas's shotgun from where it hung. She'd noticed it the first day, had made a point of understanding the loading mechanism and the safety position 2 days later, not dramatically, just quietly, in the evening when Silas was outside, because she'd understood even then that there might be a night when she needed it. She broke it open. Both shells. She closed it and walked back to the door and opened it and stepped back onto the porch. Rankin saw the shotgun and went very still. "I want to be clear," Evelyn said. Her voice was completely level. The hands holding the gun were not shaking. She was almost surprised by that. "I am not going anywhere. This is my home. I am legally resident at this property. And if any one of you dismounts or approaches this porch, I will treat it as a threat to my person and respond accordingly." The 4 men looked at each other. Rankin looked at the shotgun, at her face, back at the shotgun. "Mrs. Boone, you should leave now," she said, "before my husband gets back. He's got considerably less patience than I do." That part wasn't quite true. Silas had remarkable patience in most situations, but it was useful, and she'd learned from Mercer himself that the useful statement and the precise statement were sometimes different things. Rankin sat on his horse for another few seconds. Then he turned without another word, and the 4 men rode out of the yard, and she stood on the porch with the gun and watched them until they were through the gate and the dust had mostly settled. Then she sat down on the porch step because her legs had stopped working properly. She sat there for maybe 10 minutes. The cold was coming in under her collar. The light was starting to angle low across the yard. A crow landed on the fence post 30 feet away and looked at her with the judgmental blankness that crows had perfected, and she looked back at it and said, out loud, to no one, "I'm all right." The crow left. She wasn't all right exactly. Her heart was still doing something irregular, and her hands, now that she let herself check, were trembling badly enough to be embarrassing. But she was on the porch. The men were gone. The ranch was still here. That counted. She was inside starting supper when Silas came back. She heard him before she saw him. The horse, the creak of the gate, the specific sound of boots on the porch that she'd already learned to distinguish from other footsteps. He came in and started to say something about the south pasture, and then he looked at her and stopped. She was aware she probably looked strange. Her color was off. She was stirring something on the stove with more concentration than it required. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. She told him. All of it, in the order it occurred, without editorializing. His face went through several things while she talked. Anger, she could see that, a contained, furious kind, but he let her finish before he said anything. When she was done, he was quiet for a full minute. "You pointed a loaded shotgun at 4 of Mercer's hired men," he said. "Yes." "By yourself?" "Yes." He put his hat on the hook, took it off, put it on the table instead. "They could have— I know what they could have done," she said. "I calculated it. 4 men and me alone didn't give me many options that didn't involve being removed from the property, which is what Mercer wanted. So I chose the option where they were uncertain about what I was willing to do. That's—" He stopped. "Reckless," she offered. "I was going to say something else." She looked at him. He was looking at the gun, which she'd hung back on the wall, and his expression had the quality of a man recalibrating something fundamental about what he's been seeing. "What were you going to say?" she asked. He picked up his hat from the table, hung it properly on the hook. "That I've been out on this ranch for 8 years and nobody—" He paused. "Nobody's stood on that porch for it like that. Nobody but me." She didn't say anything. The stove crackled. The food needed attention, and she gave it attention, and he sat down at the table, and neither of them spoke again for a while. But the silence was different. It had lost the watchful quality it started with, that careful mutual assessment that had characterized every moment they spent in the same room for the first 2 weeks. Something in it had gone quiet in a way that felt less like tension and more like 2 people settling into the same space without needing to justify it. Hester came the next morning. She had clearly already heard, which told Evelyn something about the information speed of Harlan County. This community of scattered homesteads managed to transmit news with a speed that defied its distances. 4 men, Hester said, sitting at the table, eating Evelyn's cornbread without asking, same as always. "And you stood them down." "I had a shotgun. Lots of people have shotguns. Not everyone picks them up." "I didn't have another good option." "You always have the option of running." "I don't," Evelyn said. "Not from this." Hester studied her. "You know what I thought when Silas told me he'd agreed to the mail order arrangement?" "I can guess." "I thought, this is going to be some poor woman's ruin, coming out here not knowing what she was walking into." Hester broke off a piece of cornbread. "I was right about one thing. She didn't know what she was walking into." "No," Evelyn agreed, "but I was wrong about the ruin part." She left shortly after, and Evelyn stood in the doorway watching her go and thought about what she'd said, and then thought about Mercer and what he'd do next. She'd already sent the rider home without the result Mercer expected. She'd closed the technical gap in the residency filing. She'd stood 4 men off the porch. Each move she made was, in its way, a provocation. She understood that. You couldn't block a man like Mercer without escalating his response, and she'd been escalating from the moment she told the first rider she wasn't going anywhere. The question was what he had left that he was willing to use, and how far he was willing to go, and whether the 19 days remaining before the inspection were long enough for him to go further than she could manage. She thought about her father. The way he'd handled Mercer across 10 years of business, agreeing, adjusting, retreating, always looking for the accommodation that would make the pressure stop, never finding one because the pressure didn't stop when you accommodated it. It simply moved into the space you'd given it and pressed again from there. She wasn't going to do that. The following week was quieter than she expected. Too quiet. She'd learned enough about Mercer's methods to distrust his silences. They didn't mean withdrawal, they meant preparation. She found herself watching the ridgeline in the evenings, checking the fence line each morning, noting small things. A gate left open that she was certain she'd closed. A section of the creek bank that looked like horses had been standing there recently. Nothing definitive, nothing she could hold. Silas noticed her checking things. He didn't say anything about it for several days, and then one morning over coffee he said, "He's not going to hit the fence again." "No," she agreed. "If I were Mercer, I'd go after the water." She looked up. "Creek's the only reliable source for the eastern pasture," he said. "Upstream of us by about 3 miles before it comes onto the property. If someone dammed it or redirected it, the eastern pasture dries out. Cattle drift. Inspection shows a failing operation." "Can he do that legally?" "He doesn't need legal. He needs it to look like weather or sedimentation or a natural blockage. By the time we figured out it was deliberate, the inspection might already be over." She held her coffee cup and thought. "We need someone watching that creek," she said. "I can't spare anyone to watch it full time. It's just us." "Then we take turns." "Evelyn, I know it's 1.5 miles up. I know it's cold. I know I don't know the terrain as well as you do." She put the cup down. "I also know that if we lose the water, we lose the inspection, and if we lose the inspection, we lose the valley. So, we take turns." He looked at her across the table. He'd been doing this more often lately. The specific kind of looking that seemed to be checking for something, as though he expected to eventually find the limit of what she was willing to do, and each time he checked, he came back without having found it. "Fine," he said. They started rotating the creek watch that afternoon. Evelyn took the morning shift, which required leaving before first light and making the climb in darkness, which was genuinely unpleasant in ways she was no longer bothering to document because documentation required emotional energy she needed for other things. She learned the creek, the sound of it in different sections, the places where the bank was soft enough to show tracks, the particular shapes of the rocks upstream where any deliberate blockage would most likely be placed. She found nothing for 4 days. On the 5th day, she found boot prints on the north bank, 2 sets, boot heels pointing toward the creek, and then away again. Someone had stood there and left. Not done anything yet, or not finished doing it, but stood there and assessed. She didn't go back down to the ranch to tell Silas. She sat on the bank in the cold morning and waited. An hour later, she heard them coming. Not loud, not careless, but she'd been sitting still long enough that her hearing had adjusted, and she caught the sound of movement through the brush before she saw anything. 2 men, working their way along the upper bank toward the natural narrows, where damming would be easiest. They hadn't seen her yet. She stood up. They stopped. The 2 men and Evelyn Ashford looked at each other across 30 feet of frozen creek bank, and she thought, this is the moment, right here. This is where it matters what you do, not what you plan to do. "This is private property," she said. "From this point upstream, the water rights on this creek belong to the Boone Ranch. You're trespassing." One of the men, younger, uncertain, clearly not the decision-maker, looked at the other one. The other was older, more deliberate. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at the space around her. He was checking, she understood, whether she was alone. She was. "Ma'am," the older one said, "we're just checking the watershed. Routine county." "No, you're not," she said, "and we both know that. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk back the way you came. And if you come back, if either of you or anyone else Mercer sends comes within 1 mile of this creek before October 15th, I will be at the county clerk's office by the next morning filing an interference complaint against Calvin Mercer's operations by name, and I will attach to that filing a written account of every incident that has occurred at this property in the past month, including the 4 men who came to the ranch 2 weeks ago, which I documented in detail on the day it happened." She let that land. "A complaint like that," she continued, "filed 15 days before a county inspection would trigger a review. Mr. Mercer's relationship with county officials would become a subject of scrutiny. His business dealings in this valley would be examined. I don't believe that's what he wants right now." The older man was completely still. She could see him running the calculation. She was running it too, and they both knew the same thing. She was bluffing about half of it. The documentation was real. The complaint was real and possible. The downstream effects she was describing were probable but not certain, but he didn't know which parts were solid and which parts were reach. That was the only card she had, and she played it completely flat. No tremor, no tell. He turned around, said something low to the younger man. They walked back the way they'd come. Evelyn waited until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she sat back down on the bank, because standing up was taking more than she had, and she pressed her hands flat against the cold earth, and she said nothing, and she breathed, and the creek ran on beside her with absolute indifference to what had just happened. She was shaking again. She kept doing this, holding steady through the thing itself and then falling apart in the quiet after. She didn't know if that was a character flaw or just biology, and she didn't have the energy to figure it out. She sat there until it passed. Then she got up and walked back down to the ranch, and when Silas saw her face, he said, "Tell me." And she did. And he listened the whole way through with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and at the end he said, "The documentation. You really wrote it all down?" The night it happened. The 4 men, the names you caught, the times, all of it. He was quiet. Something moved through his expression that she was still learning to read. He wasn't an expressive man in the conventional sense. Emotion didn't parade across his face, but it was in there, in the way his jaw shifted, in the set of his shoulders, in the long pause before he spoke. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "He's not going to stop," he said. "You know that. Whatever you do, he's going to keep going. He's got more money than either of us, and more time." "I know." "The inspection is 14 days away." 13, she said. 13. "I know," she said again. "And I'm not going to stop either, so I suppose we find out which of us runs out first." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he uncrossed his arms, and he said, with a quietness that came from somewhere deeper than his usual economy of speech, "I should have filed that arrival date myself, the day you got here. I should have known to look for that gap." She was surprised by it, not the admission, but the fact that he chose to make it. He was not a man who cataloged his own failures out loud. "You couldn't have known he'd try to use it," she said. "I should have assumed. He'd been working against me for 2 years. I should have assumed he'd work against the marriage too." "Well," she said, "now we both know." He nodded. He went out to check the evening pasture. She started supper. Through the one clean window, she watched the ridge line go dark as the light failed, and she counted the days in her head for what felt like the 100th time. And she thought about Mercer in his office somewhere, recalculating, deciding what was left in his hand to play. 13 days. She would account for every single one of them. 13 days sounds like enough time until you're living inside them. The morning after she turned the men away from the creek, Evelyn woke before the alarm she'd set. A specific arrangement of kindling sticks against the loft wall that would clatter if she rolled over, which was the best solution she'd found to not having a clock that worked reliably above freezing, and lay still in the dark listening to the wind and doing the arithmetic she did every morning now. 13 days. The inspection was October 15th. It was the 2nd of October. The filing at Dorsey's office listed her arrival as the 23rd of September. The numbers held. As long as nothing knocked them sideways, the numbers held. She got up. She dressed in the dark because the candle was downstairs and she'd stopped being precious about that kind of thing around day 4. She climbed down from the loft and found Silas already at the stove, already making coffee, and he pushed a cup toward her without looking up from whatever he was working out in his head, and she took it and stood at the window and looked at the ridgeline coming gray out of the black and thought, 12 more mornings like this. She could do 12 more mornings. What she hadn't told Silas yet, what she was still working out how to say, was that the 2 men at the creek had been sloppy. Not incompetent, but careless in a specific way that suggested they hadn't expected resistance. Mercer's first moves had been careful and considered. The fence, the rider with his polished manners, the legal document Rankin had pretended to carry, all of those had the clean fingerprints of a man who believed he was operating without real opposition. The creek men had been different, faster, less prepared for a complication, which meant either Mercer was running out of careful options or he was running out of patience. And in her experience, those two things often looked identical right up until they diverged violently. She didn't say any of this to Silas over breakfast, Not because she was hiding it. She'd stopped hiding her assessments from him somewhere around week 2, when it became clear that he processed information better than most people she'd known, and that keeping things from him only created gaps where he'd fill in worse guesses. But because she needed to think it through one more time before she handed it to someone else. Instead, she said, "Tell me about the upper pasture, the one you want to expand into after the inspection." He looked up. "Why?" "Because we're going to pass the inspection and I'd like to know what comes after." A pause. He drank his coffee. "It's about 60 additional acres, borders the Clamp property on the east. Better grass than the south pasture, less rocky. I've been planning to run about 30 head up there once I have legal title clear." "Water access?" "There's a secondary spring about half a mile in. Runs good through summer." "You'd need fencing." "Yeah." "How long would that take you?" "Alone?" "Most of the winter." She looked at her cup. "Not alone," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I suppose not." It was a small thing, but it was the first time either of them had talked about after, in a way that included both of them without having to say it explicitly, and they both knew it, and neither of them made it into something bigger than it was, which was the right call. She went to check the fence line. He went to the south pasture. The day moved forward. On the 4th of October, Hester Clamp arrived. Not with a covered pot, but with an expression that meant she had information she wasn't sure how to deliver, which was unusual enough that Evelyn put down what she was doing and paid full attention. "Sit," Evelyn said. "I'll stand." Hester stood in the middle of the room with her coat still on, which she never did. "I heard something in town yesterday from Marjorie Vass, who I know can be loose with the facts, but she heard it from her brother-in-law who works freight at the Eastern Depot, and he's generally reliable." "What did you hear?" "Mercer had a meeting last week with Judge Parrish." Evelyn went very still. "County Judge Parrish." "The same." "About what?" "Nobody knows the exact content, but Parrish has the authority to appoint the county inspector. He can choose who does the October 15th inspection." Hester paused. "He's appointed 2 inspectors in the last year who later turned out to have financial relationships with Mercer's investment office." Evelyn sat down, which she almost never did in the middle of the day. She sat and looked at the floor and thought. "So the inspection itself could be compromised," she said. "Could be. Might not be. Marjorie's brother-in-law heard part of a conversation in a freight office. That's not evidence of anything. But it's a pattern." "It's a pattern," Hester agreed. The front door opened and Silas came in, reading their faces in about 4 seconds flat. "What happened?" Evelyn told him. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to rely on, his ability to sit inside difficult information without filling the space around it with noise. When she finished, he said, "If the inspector is Mercer's man, it doesn't matter what we've done. He'll find a reason to fail us." "Yes." "Can we challenge the appointment?" "We could try. But a legal challenge to a judge's appointment of an inspector filed by the party being inspected 11 days before the inspection, a judge who's already talking to Mercer will just deny it, and the clock keeps running." "Then what do we do?" She looked at Hester. "Who else has authority to conduct or oversee the inspection? Is it solely the county judge's appointment?" Hester thought. "The county board can override an inspector's findings if they receive a formal challenge. 3 of the 5 board members would have to vote to override." "Do you know the board members?" "I've lived here 30 years. I know everyone." "How many of them are in Mercer's pocket?" A pause. "Possibly 1. Emmett Crane. He's had investments managed by Mercer's office for years. The other 4 are independent." If the inspection failed on what appeared to be a technicality, and we filed a formal board challenge within 48 hours, 4 out of 5 board members could overturn it, Hester said slowly, if they believed the challenge had merit. "We need to make sure they know this inspection is being watched," Evelyn said. "Before it happens, not after. If the 3 honest board members are aware going in that there may be irregularities, they're less likely to simply accept the inspector's findings without question." "You want to warn them," Silas said. "I want to introduce myself," she said, and share a few facts about the pattern of interference this ranch has experienced over the past month, documented facts, with dates. Silas and Hester looked at each other. She's going to talk to the board members, Hester said. She is, Silas said. All three of them? Probably all four, to be safe. Hester looked back at Evelyn with something that was not quite amusement and not quite respect, but occupied the territory between them. All right, she said. I'll drive. Touch-up. They went the next morning. Hester drove because she knew every road in Harlan County by feel, and also because Evelyn was using the travel time to organize her notes, writing in the small journal while the wagon moved, getting the sequence of events clean and orderly and stripped of anything that sounded like complaint. The four board members they needed lived in 3 different locations spread across the county. They visited them over 2 days, which meant one night at Hester's house, a dense, warm, slightly chaotic house that smelled like dried herbs and old wool and the particular good smell of a home that has been lived in hard for a long time. The first 2 board members were easy. A retired cattleman named Webb, who listened to everything Evelyn said with his arms folded and then said, I've been suspicious of how Mercer keeps landing county opportunities for 3 years. Nobody's ever come to me with documentation before. He took her written account without ceremony and folded it into his coat pocket like he was planning to do something with it promptly. The second, a woman named Greer, who ran the largest feed operation in the county's northern quarter, heard Evelyn out and said, If Parrish appoints Tilson as inspector, that's the tell. Tilson's done Mercer's inspections twice before and found issues nobody else could locate. If it's anyone else, you're probably fine. If it's Tilson, come to me the morning after, and we will convene a board review. Evelyn wrote down the name Tilson and underlined it. The third board member was harder. A man named Aldous Prentice, who'd been on the county board for 11 years and had the careful neutrality of someone who'd made a career of not committing to anything until the outcome was already determined. He listened to Evelyn with the polite attention of a man who was going to do exactly nothing with what he heard. And when she finished, he said, The county takes its inspection processes very seriously. I'm sure the inspector, whoever is appointed, will conduct a thorough and impartial review. I'm sure, Evelyn said pleasantly. I just wanted you to be aware of the documentation I've compiled, in case it becomes relevant. Of course, Prentice said. They shook hands and she left, and when they were back in the wagon, Hester said, Waste of time. Not entirely, Evelyn said. Now he knows I've talked to the others. He doesn't know what they said. He'll spend the next week wondering whether being on the wrong side of this would put him in the minority of 4, which is not a comfortable position. You're betting he'll follow whichever way the wind blows. I'm betting that men like Aldous Prentice always do. Hester made a considering sound and drove on. They got back to the ranch on the evening of the 7th. 9 days to the inspection. Silas had kept everything running in her absence with a competence that required no comment. But when she came in, he looked at her with something immediate and concerned that he converted, not quite fast enough, into a neutral expression. How did it go? He said. She sat down. She was tired in a specific way that had nothing to do with physical labor. The tiredness of sustained performance, of choosing every word for 2 days straight and monitoring the effect of each one. Webb and Greer are with us if we need them. Prentice is a variable. The 4th I didn't get to in person. Hester sent a letter. You think Mercer knows you went to them? He'll know by tomorrow morning. What does that do? It either makes him careful or it makes him desperate. She pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment. And I don't know which one he is right now, and that bothers me. Eat something, he said. Silas, you've been moving for 2 days. Eat something and then figure out which one he is. She ate something. It helped, which she hated to admit because she would have preferred to stay in the problem rather than address the basic logistics of having a body. Silas had made soup, which he'd left warming on the back of the stove, and she ate it and didn't taste most of it, but felt the warmth of it settle something that needed settling. 8 days, she said. 8 days, he agreed. What's the inspection actually look like? Walk me through it. He explained the process. The inspector arrived, documented the property boundaries, verified the habitation requirements, assessed the operational status of the ranch, cattle count, infrastructure condition, water access, and submitted a report to the county judge within 48 hours. The judge then issued a determination on the land claim. Operational status, she said. What does that mean exactly? What are the failure conditions? Inspector can flag insufficient cattle numbers for the acreage, water access issues, abandonment indicators, habitation not appearing genuine or continuous. So if the inspector was inclined to fail us, the easiest path would be water access. Or cattle count. If they came during a day when the herd was split across pastures and gave me a number that didn't match the filing, we need both herds consolidated the day of the inspection. That's going to mean moving the north group 2 days before and holding them in the south pasture, which they won't like. Can you do it? Yeah, it won't be pretty. I'll help. He looked at her. You've never moved cattle. I've watched you for 3 weeks. I'll make mistakes. I'll correct them. A beat. The north pasture group has 3 bulls in it that are genuinely terrible, he said. I'll stay wide of them. You won't be able to. That's not how moving cattle works. Then I'll figure it out when I get there, she said, like everything else. He didn't argue. She was learning that this was how he gave ground, not by agreeing out loud, but by stopping the argument, and that the two things were the same with him. On the 9th of October, 6 days before the inspection, the temperature dropped 30 degrees overnight, and by morning there was 3 inches of snow on the ground with more coming, and Evelyn stood on the porch in the gray early light and looked at it and thought, of course. She'd known intellectually that Montana winters were severe. She'd been told. She'd felt the cold building for weeks, each morning a few degrees deeper than the last, each night requiring another layer, another adjustment to the fire-tending routine. But the first real snow had a weight to it beyond the physical, the specific psychological announcement that the landscape was done accommodating human plans and was now simply operating according to its own priorities. Silas came out beside her. He looked at the sky, not the ground. It'll ease by noon, he said. Another front behind it, though. Maybe 2 days. Does it affect the cattle? Some. Not critically. The South Pasture Group has shelter access. North Group. He stopped. What? North Group is still up. I was going to move them tomorrow. How much snow can they handle? A few inches, fine. If this turns into a proper early blizzard... He was looking at the sky again, that reading weather look he had. I need to get them down today. Then we go today. Evelyn, you've never... You said that about the water haul too, she said, and about the fence check, and about the kindling. This is different. Different how? He was quiet for a moment. It's going to be cold enough that if something goes wrong up there, it becomes a serious problem fast. It's not like the yard. You can't just go inside. She understood what he was actually saying. I'm trying to protect you, and I don't know how to say that without making you argue with me. She'd been watching this particular communication pattern develop for 2 weeks, and she didn't have a clean solution for it. Nothing is going to go wrong, she said, that we can't manage together better than you can manage alone. He looked at her for a long moment, the snow coming down between them, and then he said, Dress warmer than you think you need to. She dressed warmer than she thought she needed to. It still wasn't warm enough, but she was past the point of letting temperature be the variable that stopped her. The cattle drive down from the north pasture was the hardest physical thing she had done in a life that had recently redefined what hard meant. The north group was 61 animals, none of whom were interested in moving in a snowstorm, 3 of whom were bulls with the specific intractable stubbornness that seemed to be a professional requirement for that role, and all of whom had opinions they were willing to express loudly and with their bodies. She learned things in the first 30 minutes that she would not have learned in 3 weeks of watching. How to read which direction an animal was about to move before it moved, how to use her position relative to the herd to create pressure without panic, the difference between a steer that was simply slow and a steer that was about to turn and create a problem. She made mistakes. She made a lot of mistakes. Silas corrected some of them with a shout across the herd, and some of them with a sharp look, and some of them by simply repositioning himself to cover the gap she'd created, all of it without once stopping to explain or criticize, which was probably the only reason they finished the drive in 4 hours instead of 6. They came into the south pasture with 61 animals and a sky that had gone from gray to an active, pressing white, the snow now coming sideways in a wind that made her eyes water continuously. "Good," Silas said, closing the south pasture gate. He was breathing hard. She was breathing harder. "Good count?" "I had 60, she said. "Lost Rankin. The gray steer. In that last section." He went around the back of the rock formation. I pushed him through. 61. "Right." They looked at each other across the gate. Both of them were covered in snow and the particular debris that accumulates during an extended argument with cattle, and they were both too cold and too tired to say anything gracious about what had just happened. "Thank you," Silas said. It was the first time he'd said that to her. Not for coffee or meals, not for the fence checks or the water haul, not for the creek watch or the conversation with the board members. He said thank you easily enough in the small domestic transactions of the cabin, but he'd said this one differently, and they both heard it. She nodded. She didn't trust her voice right at that moment, which was frustrating, so she just nodded, and they walked back to the cabin in the snow. Inside, with the stove going and something hot in her hands, she thought about her mother. Her mother had been a Newport woman in every sense, beautiful, managed, contained in all the ways that her world required. She had once told Evelyn, during a summer when Evelyn was perhaps 13, and going through the particular miserable phase of being neither a child nor adult and handling it badly, "A woman of quality, Evelyn, is never visibly uncomfortable." She thought her mother would be appalled by her current state. Wet through, hands cracked, a bruise on her left hip from where a steer had nudged her into the fence rail. Her dress, she'd long abandoned the good dresses. She was wearing a work dress that had been Hester's and fit her approximately. Her dress caked with mud along the hem. She also thought her mother would not have lasted a single week here, and that the difference between them, whatever had made Evelyn stay while another woman might have gotten back on the first train, was not breeding or education or any quality her mother's world had valued. It was something else, something she couldn't fully name but had begun to trust. "Storm's going to be real," Silas said. He was looking out the window. "It'll pass by the 13th, I think, maybe the 14th. The day before the inspection." "Yeah. If the inspector has to travel in difficult conditions—" "He's county," Silas said. "He'll make it. Unless he uses the conditions as a reason to postpone, and then calls for a re-inspection at a date past the deadline." "Can he do that?" "I don't know," she said. "I need to find out." She couldn't get to Harlan in the storm. She wrote a letter to Hester instead, asking about the postponement protocol, and gave it to a passing freight rider the next morning with a coin and a specific request for a fast reply. The reply came back in 36 hours, which she considered remarkable given the weather. No postponement protocol in the ordinance. Inspection happens on the 15th or the claim lapses. Inspector can't reschedule. Good. One less variable. The storm settled in properly on the 10th and the 11th, and they were effectively confined to the property. Evelyn used the time to do things she'd been postponing, the complete inventory of the ranch's records, organizing them in a way that would hold up to scrutiny, copying the key documents in her own handwriting to create a second set she could bring to the board if needed. She fixed a section of the window seal that had been letting cold in. She darned every sock that needed darning, which occupied an entire evening. She read through Silas's cattle records going back 4 years, because she hadn't done that yet, and she should have, and she made notes. Silas, to her perpetual amazement, spent one of the storm evenings carving something. She'd noticed the tools on a shelf and assumed they were for repairs. He sat at the table with a piece of wood and a small knife and worked at it in silence while she organized papers, and after about an hour she realized it was going to be some kind of bird. A hawk, she thought, the shape of the wings. She didn't say anything about it for a long time. Then, "How long have you been doing that?" "Since I was 12, he said. "My father taught me." "Were you close to him?" A pause, the kind that contained its own answer. "We were close in the way you're close to someone you work beside every day. We didn't talk much." "That sounds familiar," she said, meaning to deflect, but he looked up and she realized it had landed differently. "Your father," he said. "My father and I talked a great deal," she said, "but not about things that mattered. We talked about everything except the state of the finances, and the state of his decisions, and the state of his relationship with Mercer. Those 3 topics were simply absent from every conversation we ever had." And now he's gone. And now he's gone. Silas set the carving down. He looked at the wood for a moment. My father left me the lease on 30 acres and a promise that working hard was enough. The lease ran out. The 30 acres were sold. I built this from nothing, and I am not going to lose it to a man like Mercer. No, she said. You're not. We're not, he corrected. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them, same as that first night weeks ago when he'd asked her why she'd really come. He looked different to her now than he had then. Not changed exactly, but she'd accumulated enough information about who he was that the initial blankness had filled in. The careful deliberation, the physical steadiness that came from 8 years of relying on himself. The specific humor he had that surfaced in the most unexpected moments and was gone before most people noticed it. The way he'd said, "Not alone this morning," about the upper pasture fencing. 4 more days, she said. 4 more days, he agreed. The storm moved through on the 13th, as Silas had predicted. On the 14th, the sky cleared to the kind of blue that happens after big weather. Sharp and very clean, as though the storm had scrubbed something. The snow on the ground was deep enough to matter, but not impassable. The cattle were intact. The water ran clear. The south pasture held all 123 animals in visible, countable proximity. Evelyn walked the full property that afternoon. Every fence line, the creek access, the cabin exterior, the barn. She walked it the way she imagined an inspector would walk it, looking for anything that could be flagged, anything that could be called insufficient or irregular. She found 3 things: a loose section of barn wall that she marked to show Silas, a gate latch that needed tightening, and a section of the creek bank that had eroded slightly in the storm runoff. She fixed the gate latch herself. The barn wall she told Silas about, and he repaired it before supper. The creek bank was cosmetic and almost certainly too minor to matter, but she built it up with stones anyway because she had the time and the energy, and she had not come this far to leave a single preventable thing undone. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in the loft listening to the wind, which had reduced itself to something ordinary, and she thought about every decision she'd made since stepping off the train in Harlan. The filing at Dorsey's office, the shotgun on the porch, the creek, the board members. She turned each one over and looked at it from the angle she hadn't used at the time, checking for what she'd missed, what she'd gotten wrong, what she should have done differently. She found things. Not many, but some. She would have talked to the board members sooner, not with 8 days to go, but with 15. She would have checked the water rights documentation in week 1 rather than week 3. She would have been more specific with Rankin when he came to the door about the legal basis for what she was saying. She'd bluffed part of it, and it had worked, but it was still a bluff, and bluffs had failure modes. She lay with all of that. And then eventually she let it go, because it was the 14th, and there was nothing to do now but get up in the morning and be ready. Below her she could hear Silas not sleeping either. He was quiet about it. She could tell only because there was no sound, no shift or settle of someone who'd actually gone under. Just the same awake stillness she was doing, both of them lying in the dark on either side of a loft floor, waiting for morning. "Silas," she said quietly. A beat. "Yeah." "We did everything we could." A longer pause. "Yeah." "Whatever happens tomorrow. We're going to pass," he said. Not reassurance, conviction, the quiet kind that comes from having run the math and arrived at a conclusion you're committed to. She thought about everything she'd seen in the past month, the man who'd slept on the floor so she could have the loft, who'd told her the trick about the wet rocks without making it a lesson, who'd fixed the barn wall before she'd finished describing the problem, who'd said not alone about the upper pasture fencing like it was the most ordinary statement in the world. "Yes," she said. "We are." The fire in the stove below had burned down to coals. The cabin held its warmth a little longer than it had any right to, given the gaps in the walls and the cold pressing in from outside. Morning was 4 hours away. The cattle in the south pasture were quiet. She closed her eyes and let the night use itself up. The inspector's name was Tilson. Evelyn found out at 7 in the morning on October 15th when Hester appeared at the door, having ridden through the post-storm mud in the dark to get there, her coat damp and her expression carrying the specific weight of bad news delivered as fast as possible. "Parrish appointed Tilson," Hester said. "I heard last night. I came as soon as it was light enough to ride." Evelyn stood in the doorway and absorbed this. Behind her, Silas was at the stove. She heard him stop moving. "All right," she said. "You know what that means," Hester said. "It means the inspection is going to find a problem," Evelyn said, "which means we need Webb and Greer ready to convene a board review the moment Tilson submits his report. I already sent word to both of them this morning. Webb said he'll have his wagon ready. Greer said the same." "Good." Evelyn stepped back from the door. "Come in. There's coffee." Hester came in. Silas turned from the stove. His face had done the thing it did with bad information. Gone still, the working through happening somewhere behind his eyes. "Tilson's going to fail the inspection," he said. Not a question. "He's going to try," Evelyn said. "We need to document everything he does today. Every note he writes, every flag he raises, every area he chooses to examine, and every area he chooses not to examine. I'm going to follow him through the entire inspection. He won't like that. He doesn't have to like it." Silas looked at her for a moment. "And if the report goes to Parrish and Parrish upholds it, then we go to the board within 48 hours with our documentation, Tilson's report, the pattern of interference I've already recorded, and the support of at least 2 board members who've been watching this situation. And we make the case that the inspection was conducted in bad faith." "That's a long way to go," Hester said. "Yes," Evelyn agreed, "but it's the way we have." She poured coffee. They sat for 20 minutes, not talking much. And then Hester left to position herself in Harlan where she could receive news. And Silas went out to do the morning checks. And Evelyn sat alone at the table for exactly 5 minutes, allowing herself to feel the full weight of what was happening. The specific cold fear of a situation where you've done everything correctly and the outcome is still not certain because the people controlling parts of it cannot be trusted. She let herself feel it. Then she put it away and made breakfast and set the table and waited. Tilson arrived at 9:10. He was a compact man, somewhere near 50, with the unhurried efficiency of someone who'd done this particular kind of work long enough that it had become mechanical. He carried a leather case and a ledger, and he shook Silas's hand with the professional neutrality of a man deliberately presenting no surface to read. He looked at Evelyn with a brief nod that suggested he'd registered her existence and categorized it as peripheral. "Mrs. Boone," he said. "Mr. Tilson," she said. "I'll be accompanying you through the inspection." He looked at her. "That's not standard. The ordinance doesn't prohibit the property owners from being present during the inspection process," she said. I looked. "We'd like to be available to answer any questions and to observe the process for our own records." A pause. "As you like." He started with the cabin. Evelyn followed him through every room, both rooms, technically, plus the loft he climbed up to inspect, and watched everything he looked at and wrote down what he looked at and when. He checked the habitation indicators, the stove, the bedding arrangements, the food stores, the personal effects that indicated 2 people living there continuously. He was thorough. She watched him, specifically, not write down several things that clearly met the requirement. The second set of work clothes hanging by the door. The 2 coffee cups on the shelf with the wear patterns that came from daily use. The small details that added up to 2 people have been living here. He didn't record the things that helped them. She recorded that he didn't record them. Outside, he walked the property perimeter. Silas accompanied him on this portion, answering questions about the fence lines and the boundary markers with the concise accuracy of a man who has walked this property enough times that its dimensions are part of how he thinks. Evelyn walked 4 steps behind Tilson, writing continuously, her journal open against the cold wind, her handwriting cramped and efficient because she was trying to get everything down while it was happening. Tilson noticed her writing. He glanced back twice. She met his eyes both times without expression and continued writing. The cattle count was next. 123 animals in the south pasture, visible and countable, which was exactly what the filing said. Tilson counted them. He counted them twice. He came up with a number that was not 123. I'm getting 118, he said. Silas said, Count again? I've counted twice. Count a third time, Silas said, because there are 123 animals in that pasture, and I can tell you where each of them came from and what I paid for them. Tilson counted a third time. He came up with 121. The filing states 123, he said, making a note. Mr. Tilson, Evelyn said. She kept her voice completely flat. I'd like to note for my records that this is your third count, and you've produced 3 different numbers. I'd also like to note the time. She checked the watch she'd borrowed from Hester. 9:54, at which you completed the count and the weather conditions and the specific section of fence line from which you conducted it. Tilson looked at her. What are you writing? Everything, she said. Same as you. Something shifted in his expression. Not enough to constitute guilt, but enough. I'll note a discrepancy, he said. You can note whatever you like, she said. I'll be noting what I observed. He moved to the water access. The creek ran clear. The upper access point was exactly what the filing described. He stood at the creek bank and looked upstream, and Evelyn watched him look and thought, there's nothing wrong here, and he knows there's nothing wrong here, and he has to find a way to note something anyway, because that's what he was paid to do. He wrote something in his ledger. She couldn't see the exact wording. What are you recording for water access? She asked. I note what I observe. Then we agree, she said. The creek runs clean to the property boundary and provides adequate access for the stated herd size. That's what I'm noting. He didn't confirm or deny it. He spent another 40 minutes walking the property, and by the end of it, Evelyn had 14 pages of notes and a clear picture of what the report was going to say. He was going to flag the cattle count discrepancy. He was probably going to find something about the water access. Not enough to be obviously fabricated, but enough to raise a question. He might, if he was confident enough, find something about the habitation continuity. I'll have my report to the judge by tomorrow morning, Tilson said, closing his leather case. When can we expect the judge's determination? She asked. Within 48 hours of the report. And if there are findings that we believe are inaccurate? He looked at her with the patient expression of a man who's been asked inconvenient questions before. The county process provides for the county board, she said. Yes, I'm aware. Thank you for your time, Mr. Tilson. She shook his hand before he could manage the power dynamic of the departure, which meant the goodbye happened on her terms rather than his, which was a small thing but not nothing. She and Silas stood in the yard and watched him ride out. How bad, Silas said. Bad enough to fail us on paper, not bad enough to survive a board challenge if we present our documentation correctly. You really think the board will override Parrish? I think Webb and Greer will vote to convene a review. I think with the right presentation, the third and fourth votes follow. She closed the journal. But we have to move fast. He submits tomorrow. Parrish will move quickly after that. He'll want it done before anyone can organize a response. So we go to the board tomorrow. A sec. They were up before 4. They had to be. Harlan was 2 hours by wagon, and they needed to be at Webb's door before the judge had a chance to issue any determination. Evelyn had spent the previous evening organizing her documentation into a sequence that told the story cleanly. The fence sabotage, the rider with the false departure arrangement, Rankin and his 4 men, the creek interference, the pattern of escalating pressure, the documentation of the inspection itself including Tilson's 3 inconsistent cattle counts. She'd written a cover letter. She'd rewritten it 3 times. The final version was 2 pages, and it was the most precise thing she'd put on paper in her life. Every sentence earned its place. Nothing in it sounded emotional, though every line of it had come from something deeply felt, which was perhaps the only useful thing her education had given her. The ability to convert feeling into form when form was what the situation required. Silas read it at the table at 3 a.m. while she finished the final copy. He read it twice. He set it down. This is good, he said. It needs to be more than good. It is more than good. He looked at her directly. Evelyn, it is more than good. She held that for a moment. We need Webb to convene the review before Parrish's determination is issued. Once the judge rules, the board's ability to intervene gets more complicated. Do we know when Parrish will rule? Not exactly. Tilson said 48 hours from his report. But if Mercer has told him to move fast, she paused, we have to assume early. Then we leave at 4. They left at 4. The road was still difficult from the storm but passable, and Silas drove at a pace that was slightly faster than comfort, but within what the ground could handle. Evelyn sat beside him with the documentation folder in her lap and thought through the conversation she was going to have with Webb, the points she needed to hit, the likely objections, how to move from Webb to Greer in sequence without losing momentum. The sky was still full dark when they hit the first problem. She smelled it before she saw it. Smoke. Not wood smoke. Not the clean smell of a stove or a campfire. The thicker structural smell of something burning that was not meant to burn. She turned her head. On the south side of the road, maybe a quarter-mile off, there was an orange glow against the black that had no business being there. Silas. He'd already seen it. He pulled the horse up. That's Harmon's fence line, he said slowly. Harmon grazes the south quarter. He's not... There's nothing that should be burning out there. Who is Harmon? Old man. Lives alone. His land borders the eastern approach to Harlan. Silas was still looking at the glow. If that fire spreads toward the road, it'll block us. They looked at each other. Could be coincidence, he said. Could be, she said, in the tone that meant she didn't believe it. If it spreads to the south brush and crosses the road before we get through, we'd have to go around by the north route. That adds 2 hours, which puts us in Harlan after Parrish has had time to issue the determination. Yeah. She looked at the fire. It was growing. Not catastrophically, not yet, but the post-storm wind was picking up from the west, which was the direction that would push it toward the road. She had maybe 20 minutes, perhaps 30, before the southern crossing became impassable. Go, she said. Now. Go as fast as the road allows. Silas went. The horse was not pleased about the pace on uncertain ground and communicated this through its entire body, but Silas handled it with the controlled authority of a man who'd been working horses his whole life, keeping the speed just inside what was manageable. And they came through the southern crossing 3 minutes before the fire reached the brush line on the road's edge. Evelyn felt the heat as they passed, a wall of it against the left side of her face, and then they were through and the road ahead was clear and dark and cold. She turned and looked back. The fire was crossing the road behind them. Someone set that, Silas said. His voice was completely level. Yes. Mercer. Or someone working for him, timing it for early this morning, blocking the north road to Harlan on the day we need to get to the board. She stopped. He knew we'd try to challenge. He knew we'd go to Webb. How does he know these things? He's been in this county for years, she said. He has sources I can't identify and probably can't eliminate. What I can do is make sure that every move he makes in the next 24 hours goes into the documentation, including this fire, including the timing, including the fact that it was set on the only fast road to Harlan on the morning of the day he needed us delayed. She opened the journal on her lap, wrote the time, the location, the conditions, the estimated direction of spread. She wrote it while the wagon moved in the dark, her handwriting worse than usual from the bouncing and the cold, but legible. It was always legible. They reached Webb's property just as the sky was turning gray. Webb met them at the door in his coat, already dressed, as though he'd been expecting an early arrival. Maybe he had. He took one look at their faces and stepped back to let them in without ceremony. Tilson, he said. Filed today, Evelyn said. We need the board convened before Parrish rules. How long do we have? I don't know exactly. Tilson said 48 hours, but I think Parrish will move faster. Today, if he can. Webb read her documentation in 20 minutes at his kitchen table. He read it with the focused attention of a man who understood what he was looking at and understood what it meant. When he finished, he set it down. 3 different cattle counts, he said, in front of both of us. I have the times of each count and the numbers he produced. And the fire this morning, set at the southern crossing at approximately 4:45 this morning. We came through before it closed the road, but only just. Webb was quiet for a moment. This is a pattern, he said. It's been a pattern for weeks. Yes, Mercer's been operating in this county like nobody's watching. Nobody has been, she said. Until now. Webb stood up. I'll get Greer. We can be at the county hall by 10. If we convene the board before Parrish issues his determination, the process requires him to hold the ruling until the board review is complete. Can you do that? Force him to hold it? If 3 board members call a formal review, yes. It's in the county charter. Parrish can't issue a land determination while a formal board review of the inspection process is active. She breathed out. Then we need 3 votes to convene. I'm 1. Greer will be 2. Webb picked up his coat. The third is the question. Prentice, Silas said. Prentice or Dalloway? Dalloway's the 4th member. I think he's honest. I just don't know him well enough to be certain. Dalloway, Evelyn said. Let's try Dalloway. They tried Dalloway. He was a deliberate man, careful in the way that suggested he was used to being the least certain person in the room and had made a philosophy of it. He read Evelyn's documentation even more slowly than Webb had. He asked questions, good questions, specific ones, about the filing date at Dorsey's office, about the creek incident, about the inspection observations. She answered everything directly. At the end, he said, I want it on record that I'm not ruling on the merits of the land claim. I'm voting to convene a review because the documented pattern of interference raises legitimate questions about the integrity of the inspection process. That's exactly the right framing, she said. I don't want this to look political. It isn't political, she said. It's procedural. The procedures exist for a reason. He thought about it for another moment. All right, he said. I'll vote to convene. They had 3 votes by 9:15. They were at the county hall by 9:40. Webb filed the formal review request with the county clerk, not Dorsey, a different clerk, one she hadn't met, and the clerk's expression when he read the filing suggested this was the most complicated thing that had happened in this office in recent memory. This formally suspends the judge's determination process? Evelyn asked the clerk. Under Charter Section 14, yes. The judge cannot issue a land ruling while a formal board review of the underlying inspection is active, and Judge Parrish will be notified immediately. She thought about Mercer, somewhere in this county or beyond it, waiting for Parrish to issue a ruling that would give him the valley. She thought about how that phone was about to go very quiet on his end in a way he wasn't expecting. She thought about how he still wasn't done. A man like that was never done until the last avenue was closed. When does the board convene for the review? She asked. The charter requires within 72 hours of the formal request, the clerk said. So the 18th. At the latest, yes. 3 more days. She was so tired of counting days. They ate at a small restaurant near the county hall. She and Silas and Webb, who had become in the past 3 hours something closer to an ally than a board member, and who ate his lunch with the appetite of a man who felt he'd done something worth doing. Evelyn ordered food and then couldn't eat most of it. Her body was running on forward motion and had been for too long. You should eat, Silas said. You sound like yourself from 6 weeks ago, she said. You hadn't eaten then either. I ate. Not enough. She ate the food. It still didn't taste like much. In the afternoon, she found out that Parrish had received the board review notice at 10 in the morning and had, according to Hester's network of information, reacted with the specific controlled fury of a man who had expected a clean outcome and encountered an obstacle that was technically legitimate and therefore could not simply be dismissed. She also found out that Mercer had been in Harlan the previous evening. Hester told her this in the street outside the county hall, speaking low and quick. He was at Parrish's office yesterday at 5 in the afternoon, stayed 2 hours, left on the north road toward his property. So he knew Tilson's findings before we did. Likely. And the fire this morning, she paused. If he was still in the area last night. I can't prove he ordered it, Hester said. But the timing. Yes, Evelyn said. The timing. She added it to the documentation. Every piece. She was building something now that was larger than the original purpose. The board review was about the inspection. But the documentation she was accumulating was about Mercer's pattern in this county across years, and she was starting to understand that the Eastern Valley was not the only thing at stake here. If she could make that pattern visible to enough people with enough authority, what happened to Silas's land claim might be only the beginning of what Mercer lost. The board review was held on the 17th, one day earlier than the charter required, which Webb had pushed for and gotten. The county hall had a meeting room that Evelyn suspected was normally used for things less charged than this. 5 board members on one side of a long table, 2 chairs on the other side for the property owners. Tilson seated against the wall, a county recorder in the corner. Parrish was not present, which she thought was actually a tell. A judge confident in his inspector's findings would have attended to see them upheld. His absence suggested he already knew the findings were going to be challenged effectively and wanted distance from the outcome. Webb opened the proceedings. He read the formal complaint into the record. He admitted Evelyn's documentation. He asked Tilson to explain his 3 different cattle counts. Tilson explained that counting large numbers of animals in adverse weather conditions produced variable results. The weather was clear, Evelyn said from her chair. The inspection was conducted at 9:54 in the morning on October 15th. I have the weather conditions documented. It was cold but clear with low wind. I'd like that entered into the record alongside Mr. Tilson's characterization. It was entered. Webb asked Tilson to explain what specific water access issue he had noted in his report. Tilson described sediment buildup at the primary creek access point that he believed indicated periodic flow interruption. I was at that creek access point, Evelyn said. I have a description of the conditions I observed at the time of the inspection, including the water clarity, the flow rate, and the condition of the bank. I'd also like to enter into the record that 2 men were found at the Upper Creek on the 9th of October, which I believe was an attempt to artificially create the conditions Mr. Tilson is now describing. Those men left when confronted. I documented the incident the same day. Greer leaned forward. You're saying the creek was interfered with in advance of the inspection? I'm saying 2 men were at the Upper Creek in a position consistent with damming or diverting it, and that they left when told they were trespassing. I can't prove what they intended. I can prove they were there. The room was very quiet. Dalloway said, Mr. Tilson, in your professional assessment, is the water access at the Boone property sufficient for the stated herd size? A long pause. Tilson looked at his hands. The current flow is adequate, he said. My concern was about long-term reliability. Long-term reliability is not part of the inspection criteria, Dalloway said, checking his copy of the ordinance. The criteria requires adequate current access. Is the current access adequate? Another pause. Yes, Tilson said. The room was quiet again. Evelyn kept her face neutral. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. Webb and Greer voted to overturn Tilson's findings and certify the inspection as passed. Dalloway voted the same. Crane, the one board member with Mercer connections, voted to uphold Tilson's report. Prentice, the careful man who followed whichever way the wind blew, looked at the 3 votes already recorded and voted to certify. 4-1. The county recorder noted it. Webb signed the certification. Greer signed it. The process required it to go back to Parrish for the land determination, but with a board certification of a past inspection, the judge had no legal basis to deny the claim. Silas was very still in the chair beside her. She could feel it, the held quality of someone who was waiting to let themselves believe something. It's done, she said quietly. Not until Parrish signs. He'll sign, she said. He doesn't have a legal basis to refuse, and he knows that we have documentation that makes any refusal look like what it is. He'll sign. Parrish signed 2 days later. The land determination came to the ranch by county courier, and Silas stood in the yard and held the paper and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Evelyn stood beside him and didn't say anything either. There was a lot in the paper and a lot in the moment, and most of it didn't need language. 460 acres, Silas said finally, plus the Eastern Valley, 580. 580, she confirmed. He folded the paper. He looked at the ridgeline. The sky was the same clean blue it had been after the storm, that particular post-weather clarity. My father thought 30 acres was the start of something, he said. He was right. He just had the scale wrong. She thought about her own father, the signed contract, the mahogany desk, the way Mercer had smiled. We need to talk about what comes next, she said. The upper pasture fencing. That too, but I mean Mercer. Silas looked at her. He lost this round, she said, but we haven't cost him anything yet. We've only stopped him from gaining something. That's not the same as being done with him. What are you thinking? She'd been thinking about it since the boardroom, since the fire on the South Road, since she'd sat on the creek bank shaking and stared at the water and understood that blocking a man's moves was not the same as defeating him, and that a man with Mercer's resources could wait longer than they could afford to keep defending. I'm thinking, she said, that the best way to end this is to make it so that this county is no longer worth anything to him. And the way to do that is to make this ranch so successful that we control the opportunities he's been working toward. That's a large ambition. You told me your father had the scale wrong, she said. So did mine. I'm not interested in making the same mistake. Silas looked at the paper in his hand, then at the ridge, then at her, in the direct and considering way he had, the way she'd stopped finding uncomfortable and started finding something she wanted. Tell me what you're thinking, he said. She told him. It took a while. He listened the whole way through without interrupting, and by the time she finished, the light had shifted and the cold was coming down from the ridge, and his expression had moved through several things and arrived somewhere that was not quite wonder, but was adjacent to it. The railroad, he said. The railroad, she said, and everything that comes with it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you've been planning this since before the inspection. Since about week 2, she admitted. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. She'd been collecting those sounds for weeks like small found objects, each one different, each one slightly more available than the last. All right, he said. All right? Tell me the rest. She told him the rest. The afternoon went cold around them, and neither of them moved to go inside. And somewhere in Harlan County, a man named Calvin Mercer received word that the board had certified the inspection and the Eastern Valley was permanently secured in the name of Silas Boone. And the sound he made was the sound a very controlled man makes when something has gone wrong that he was certain could not go wrong. A sound no one who worked for him had heard before. A sound that meant the game had changed, and he hadn't changed with it, and he didn't yet know what to do about that. He would figure it out. Men like Mercer always figured out their next move, but he'd need time for that. And while he was taking his time, Evelyn Ashford Boone was standing in a yard in Montana, holding 6 weeks of survival and strategy. And something she was only beginning to name, talking about railroads and cattle and a future that had not existed when she stepped off a train at Harlan Station with $11 and a last name that no longer meant anything to anyone who mattered. It meant something now. She was just getting started with what it would mean. The railroad conversation happened over 3 evenings. Not one long strategic session. That wasn't how either of them worked. It happened in pieces, the way most real decisions do. A question over supper, an idea that surfaced while one of them was doing something else entirely, a piece of it that didn't fit and needed reworking before they could move forward. Silas asked hard questions and Evelyn answered them honestly, including the parts where her answer was, "I don't know yet," rather than something that sounded more certain than it was. The core of it was this: the Montana Central Railroad was expanding its freight lines westward, and the contracts for cattle transport were currently controlled by 2 brokers who charged rates that cut deeply into every rancher's margin. Both brokers had financial relationships with Mercer's investment office. Every cattleman in the Eastern Valley was paying Mercer a second time without knowing it, once when he'd failed to take their land, and again when he took his percentage of everything they shipped. Evelyn had worked this out in week 2, sitting with Silas's 4 years of cattle records. The numbers told the story clearly if you knew what to look for, and she knew what to look for because she'd grown up watching her father's business records, and had understood even as a girl that the most important information in any set of accounts was not what was spent, but on what, and to whom. If we negotiate directly with the railroad, she told Silas, we cut the brokers out. The railroad benefits because they get a larger, more reliable contract. We benefit because our margin improves by about 30%. And every other rancher in the valley who joins the contract benefits the same way. Every other rancher, he said. You're not just thinking about this ranch. A single ranch negotiates from one position. A group of ranches negotiates from a completely different one. She spread the records across the table. If we bring Webb and Hester and the Granger operation on the North Quarter into the same direct contract, we're talking about enough cattle volume that the railroad will take the meeting seriously. And if the railroad takes the meeting seriously, Mercer loses the broker income, Silas said slowly. He loses the broker income. And once ranchers in this county understand what they've been paying for, once the arrangement is visible rather than buried in brokerage fees, his influence in this valley starts to cost him more than it earns him. Silas sat with that for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this since week 2, he said again. "I didn't know if we'd survive to week 3, she said. "But yes, I was thinking about it." "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked at him. "Because in week 2 we were still two strangers trying not to be a burden to each other, and because I needed to understand what I was looking at before I handed it to someone else." He was quiet. Then, "Fair. Also, Sam," she said, "I wasn't sure you'd want a wife who had opinions about your business strategy." "I don't have a wife who has opinions about my business strategy," he said. "I have a wife who has better business strategy than I do. Those are different things." She looked at him for a moment. He was looking at the records, not her face, which was why he missed whatever expression she made. It was probably better that he missed it. "All right," she said. "So we take the meeting." But getting the meeting took 6 weeks. Not because the railroad was difficult. A letter to the regional freight office produced a response within 10 days that was cautious but interested, but because assembling the rancher coalition required the kind of conversation that couldn't be rushed. Webb was easy. He'd been paying brokerage fees for 11 years, and when Evelyn laid out the arithmetic for him, he sat very still and then said with feeling, 11 years, and nothing else for a while. Hester took one afternoon. She asked detailed questions about the contract terms and the railroad's track record in other territories, and whether Evelyn had considered what happened if the railroad raised their rates once the brokers were eliminated. Evelyn had considered it. She'd drafted a contract clause requiring rate stability for 5 years. Hester read it. "Make it 7, she said. Evelyn made it 7. The Granger operation was harder. Old Man Granger had been ranching the North Quarter since before Harlan was a town, and had the deep suspicion of new arrangements that came from having seen enough new arrangements fail. He listened to everything Evelyn said and then said he'd think about it. She let him think. She came back 2 weeks later. He said he'd talked to Webb. He was in 4 operations. Combined, they represented enough cattle volume that the railroad sent their regional contracts manager, a sharp-eyed woman named Ferris, out to Harlan in December to meet in person. The meeting took place at the county hall because it was the only room large enough, and Evelyn sat at the head of the table with her documentation organized and her notes clean and the specific internal steadiness of someone who has prepared for something long enough that the preparation has become confidence rather than anxiety. She was nervous anyway. She didn't let it show, which was different from not feeling it. Ferris was direct and businesslike, and had clearly done her arithmetic before arriving. The negotiation took 3 hours. At 2 points, it nearly broke down. Once over the rate structure for smaller shipments during the off-peak season, once over liability terms for animals lost in transit, and both times Evelyn found the language that moved it forward without surrendering the terms that mattered most. When it was done, and the contract was initialed pending final signatures, Ferris looked across the table at her with the professional assessment of someone who has just finished a negotiation and is recalibrating who she was sitting across from. "You've done this before," Ferris said. "No," Evelyn said. "But I paid close attention to people who had." The signed contracts came back in January. The first direct shipment under the new agreement went out in March. And when the payment came back without the brokerage deduction, Silas stood at the table and looked at the number for a long time. 32%, he said. 31.8, she said. Close enough? He put the paper down. He looked at her. What do you want to do with it? The upper pasture fencing first. We've been putting it off long enough. Then I want to talk about the secondary water system. There's a way to route from the spring to the south pasture that would take the creek pressure off during dry summers. After that, she paused. After that, I want to hire help. You can't run 580 acres and expand properly with 2 people. 3 people, he said. She looked at him. Hester's nephew, he said. He's been looking for work since fall. He's young, but he's not stupid. You already talked to him. I talked to him last week. She sat back. You've been planning too. You don't have a monopoly on thinking ahead. She laughed. It surprised her. The specific lightness of it, the way it came out without calculation. She didn't laugh easily, and when she did, it was usually at something dry and quiet, but this one was genuine and full, and she couldn't quite contain it. And Silas watched her with an expression she'd been learning to read for months now, the one that meant he was more pleased about something than he was going to say. Fine, she said. We hire Hester's nephew. Mercer's response to the railroad contract came in February, and it came not as another hired writer or a legal maneuver, but as a financial one, which was ultimately the only language he was fluent in. He moved to purchase the brokerage operation that the Rancher Coalition had bypassed, consolidating it with two other freight interests he controlled, and positioned himself to undercut the direct railroad rate for any rancher who wanted to return to the old arrangement. He sent letters to Webb and to Granger specifically, not to Silas and not to Evelyn, which told her something about how he was thinking, offering rates 10% below the railroad contract for the following year's shipments. Webb brought his letter to Evelyn. He's trying to break the coalition, he said. Yes. Will it work? Not on you or Hester, maybe on Granger, if the 10% looks better than the certainty of the long contract. Should I talk to Granger? Let me, she said. She rode to the Granger property on a cold February morning and found Old Man Granger in his barn with his letter, an expression that was not quite wavering but had the quality of a man who was doing arithmetic he didn't like. 10% is 10%, he said. For 1 year, she said, and then he raises it back. Because once you've left the coalition contract renegotiates without your volume and your rates go up. You come back to Mercer's brokerage the following year because it's the only option, and he charges you whatever he likes because he's your only option. Granger looked at the letter. He's been doing it for 11 years, she said. This is the same arrangement you were already in. He's just making it look like a choice. It is a choice, Granger said. Every trap has a door that opens, she said. That's what makes it a trap. Granger was quiet for a long time. Outside, his cattle made the low sounds they made in winter. Patient, indifferent to human calculations. My father sold cattle in this valley for 30 years, he said. He never made enough to do more than replace what wore out. I know, she said. Is this actually different? Come to the ranch next week, she said. I'll show you our first quarter numbers under the direct contract. Bring your own records. We'll look at them together and you can decide what's actually different and what isn't. He came. He brought his records. They sat at the cracked table in the cabin. Still cracked, Silas had filled it again with something that held better, but it was still cracked, and spent an afternoon going through numbers. And when they were done, Granger folded his records back into their leather case and said, He's been taking a third of what I should have been making. Close to it. A third? He sat with that. 20 years. Yes. He stayed in the coalition. Mercer's brokerage gambit failed. Not dramatically. He didn't announce that it had failed, and most people in the county never knew it had been tried. But by the end of the spring shipping season, his freight brokerage income from the Eastern Valley had dropped to near zero, and the investment he'd made in the consolidated brokerage was sitting on a depreciating asset with no obvious path to recovery. Evelyn tracked it through the freight office records, which were public documents filed with the Territorial Commerce Office. She'd started reading those records in January, the same way she'd read the ordnance and the cattle records and everything else she'd needed to understand, carefully, from the beginning, not skipping the parts that seemed dry. Hester found her doing this one morning and said, What are you looking for? Everything he owns, Evelyn said. In this county and adjacent ones. Every investment, every interest, every arrangement. I want to know the full shape of it. Why? Because I want to know which parts are vulnerable. Hester sat down across from her. You're not done with him. He's not done with us, Evelyn said. He's just regrouping, and I would rather understand his position completely before his next move than be surprised by it after. He's going to come at you differently this time. I know. You can't document your way out of everything. No, she said, but I can understand his finances well enough to know where pressure would actually hurt him, rather than where he wants me to think it would hurt him. Those are different places. Hester looked at the stack of commerce records. You know, when Silas first agreed to this arrangement, I thought, this poor woman is going to be destroyed by this place. You told me. I was wrong. You were right about one part, Evelyn said. I didn't know what I was walking into. But not knowing what you're walking into isn't the same as being unable to handle it once you're there. She looked at the records. I had never hauled water. I had never moved cattle. I had never stood in front of 4 men on horseback with a gun I wasn't certain I was going to use. I had never negotiated a freight contract. She paused. None of those things turned out to require prior experience. They required paying attention and refusing to stop. Hester was quiet for a moment. Your mother raised you like that? No, Evelyn said. My mother raised me to be managed gracefully. I had to figure out the other thing on my own. But Mercer's next move came in May, and it was the one Evelyn had been anticipating and dreading in roughly equal measure because it was the one she could see coming and still wasn't certain she could stop. He went after the water rights, not the creek. He'd tried that, and it hadn't worked, and he knew they were watching it. He went after the broader water rights filing for the Eastern Valley, challenging the historical basis of Silas's claim through the Territorial Land Office rather than the county. A territorial challenge was a different animal from a county one, bigger, slower, more expensive to fight, requiring documentation that went back further than Evelyn's careful journals and beyond the reach of Webb and Greer and the county board. The filing arrived by courier in the second week of May. Evelyn read it twice and then set it down and looked at the wall for a while. Silas came in and saw her looking at the wall and said, "What?" She handed him the filing. He read it. He set it down. "This is the territorial office." "Yes." "This isn't Webb and Greer territory." "No." "This is..." "How long does a territorial challenge process take?" 12 to 18 months, she said, during which the underlying rights are in contested status. We can still operate, but financing becomes difficult because no lender will extend credit against contested water rights. And without credit, expansion stops. Expansion stops. The upper pasture project stops. The secondary water system stops. We hold what we have, but we can't grow, which after a year or two starts to look like a failing operation rather than a successful one. She pressed her hands flat on the table. He doesn't need to take the ranch. He just needs to freeze it long enough that we can't compete with him. Can we fight the territorial filing? Yes, but it requires a lawyer who practices territorial land law, which means someone in the capital, which means expense and time and working through a process I don't have complete knowledge of. She stopped. I know the general shape of territorial law from my father's dealings. I don't know the specific case precedents well enough to build a challenge without professional help. Then we get professional help. We need the right person, she said, not just any territorial lawyer, someone who knows Mercer's methods, or at least knows the methods of men like him and has won against them before. Do you know someone like that? She thought about it. She'd been thinking about it since she'd seen the filing, going through every person she'd ever known or heard of who might fit. There's a woman, she said slowly, a legal advocate in the capital. I read about her in a commercial journal 2 years ago. She handled a water rights challenge for a mining operation in the Southern Territory and won on a precedent argument that nobody expected. Her name is Alderton. A woman advocate. Is that a problem? He looked at her. Given who's asking, no. She wrote to Alderton that evening. The response came back in 2 weeks. Alderton was available, expensive, and direct in her correspondence in a way that Evelyn found deeply reassuring. She also had, as it turned out, a prior professional encounter with Calvin Mercer's legal office, a dispute over mineral rights 3 years earlier that had ended in a settlement widely understood to be unfavorable to Mercer's position. She knew his methods because she'd had to defeat them before. She's perfect, Evelyn told Silas. Can we afford her? We can afford her better than we can afford to lose the water rights. Alderton came to the ranch in June. She was a compact, formidably efficient woman in her mid-40s who walked the full property on her first day, asked questions about the water rights history that went back to the original settlement of the valley, and spent an evening with Evelyn's documentation of the past year's interference pattern with the focused attention of someone identifying pieces of a puzzle she'd seen versions of before. "He's overextended," Alderton said on the second morning. "The territorial challenge? Everything. The brokerage investment that isn't performing, the capital he's committed to the challenge filing, the political relationships in this county that are now," she glanced at Evelyn's notes on the board review, "less reliable than they were. He's been operating on the assumption that one of his moves would work and he'd recoup. None of them have worked. Which means this territorial challenge may be his last significant card. If we defeat it, and I believe we can defeat it, there's a precedent from 1881 that applies directly to the original settlement filing. He won't have the capital or the political standing to mount another serious challenge." "How long?" 6 months of filings, 3 months of review, a decision by spring. "A year." "Approximately." Evelyn sat with a year. She'd been sitting with countdowns for so long that another one felt almost familiar. "What's our strongest argument?" "The original settlement documentation," Alderton said. "Do you have it?" "Silas has everything going back to the first lease filing." "I need to read it all." "I'll get it." She got it. Alderton read it. There were, as she'd predicted, 2 prior territorial precedents that applied favorably to the water rights claim, one from 1879 and one from 1883, both involving valley settlements in the Northern Territory where downstream claims had been challenged by large commercial interests and upheld based on the original settlement date and continuous habitation record. Continuous habitation record, the same phrase that had anchored the county inspection filing, the same ground they'd already defended, already documented, already won. "We've been building this case for a year, Silas," Evelyn said, looking at the precedents. "Not intentionally," Alderton said. "No, but every piece of documentation I kept, every incident I recorded with dates and conditions and names, it all supports the same argument: continuous, uninterrupted, legitimate operation of this ranch. Which is also the strongest possible counter to any claim of contested rights," Alderton said. "Yes." Silas, who had been sitting quietly through most of this, said, "He picked the wrong woman to send here." Alderton looked at him. "He picked the wrong woman entirely." Odd. The territorial ruling came in April of the following year, 14 months after Mercer filed the challenge. It was 3 pages long, and its language was dry and procedural in the way of official documents, but what it said, stripped of the legal scaffolding, was that the water rights claim was valid, the challenge lacked sufficient basis in territorial precedent, and the Eastern Valley water rights were confirmed in the name of the Boone Ranch operation in perpetuity. Alderton sent the ruling by express courier. Evelyn read it at the table with Silas beside her, and she read it twice the way she read everything important, once for the substance and once to check what she might have missed, and the second time confirmed what the first time said. "It's over," Silas said. "This part of it," she said, not to be contrary, because it was accurate. He looked at her. "Mercer still exists," she said. "He'll find other things to do, other people to pressure. He doesn't stop being who he is because we won. But he's done with us." "He's done with us," she agreed. "We're too expensive for him now. He spent 2 years and significant capital on moves that didn't work. Whatever he has left, he'll take somewhere else." "Good." "Yes." She looked at the ruling in her hands. The paper was ordinary. Just paper, just ink. The same material as every document she'd read in the past 2 years. But what it represented was not ordinary, and she was letting herself feel the full weight of that rather than converting it immediately into the next calculation, which was her tendency and which she was trying, with mixed success, to moderate. Outside Hester's nephew, whose name was Cal, and who had turned out to be neither young nor not stupid, but genuinely capable in ways that had expanded the ranch's capacity meaningfully in the past year, was moving the North Pasture Group with the efficiency of someone who'd learned the land by living on it. The upper pasture fencing was done. The secondary water system was 3/4 complete. They'd taken on 2 more hands in the fall. The first quarter shipping numbers under the railroad contract were the strongest the ranch had produced. She thought about the train, the burgundy dress, the $11. The contract slid across a mahogany desk like a discarded card. She thought about her father and the specific complicated grief of loving someone who failed you in ways they probably didn't intend. She'd been carrying that grief for 2 years alongside everything else, and it hadn't gotten lighter exactly, but she'd gotten stronger, which amounted to the same thing in practical terms. She thought about Mercer. Not with hatred. She'd examined the hatred during the long months of the territorial filing and found it wasn't useful, so she'd set it down the same way she'd set down the fear on the creek bank. What she felt about him now was closer to a clear and clinical understanding. He was a man who mistook other people's vulnerability for stupidity, and that mistake had cost him more than he'd budgeted for. She thought about the porch, the shotgun, the shaking hands that had steadied eventually, every time. "We should add to the east wing," she said. Silas looked at her. "Of the cabin?" "It's not going to stay a cabin much longer if we keep hiring," she said. "We need proper housing for the hands, which means we need to expand the main structure first so it's clear what we're building around. I've been drawing some ideas." "You've been drawing building plans?" "I drew them in January. I was waiting for the ruling before I brought it up." He made the almost laugh sound. "Can I see them?" "Tonight. I want to walk the east boundary first. Cal said there was a section of the fence that looked soft, and I want to see it before it becomes a problem." "I'll come." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." They walked the east boundary in the April light, which was the particular clear, generous light of a Montana spring that arrived each year like it was making up for the winter, and found the soft section of fence that Cal had flagged, 2 posts that had heaved in the freeze-thaw cycle, and marked them for repair the following morning. On the way back, they came up over the low rise that gave the longest view across the valley, and Evelyn stopped because she always stopped here, and she suspected she always would. 580 acres. The south pasture with its consolidated herd. The north pasture expanded and properly fenced, the creek running clean through the eastern edge. The cabin, not a cabin much longer, with its single clean window facing the ridge that she'd washed the first week, and kept clean every week since without quite knowing why, except that she'd wanted to be able to see the ridge in the mornings, and she still did. "What are you thinking?" Silas asked. She thought about how to answer that honestly. She'd gotten better at honest answers over the past 2 years, partly because the frontier didn't leave much room for the decorative kind, and partly because of the man standing beside her, who had a specific intolerance for performance that had, gradually and without ceremony, cured her of some of her most ingrained habits. "I'm thinking that I came here with nothing," she said, "and that nothing turned out to be enough to start from." "You came here with $11 and a last name," he said. "And you," she said. "Eventually." He looked at her. The late afternoon light was on his face. She knew that face now, knew the place where the tiredness showed, the angle at which the humor surfaced, what the set of his jaw meant versus what it looked like. 2 years of living beside someone in a small space taught you things that proximity alone couldn't. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes. I need to tell you something." She waited. "The first day," he said. "When I picked you up at the station, I thought you were going to be gone in a week. I thought Mercer had won before you even got off the train." "I know." "I was wrong." "You were," she agreed. "I've been wrong about a few things," he said, "since you got here. You've also been right about most of the practical ones. The wet rocks." "The wet rocks," she said, "and the water tank schedule, and Hester's nephew. You were right about the railroad. We were both right about some things," she said. "That seems like the appropriate arrangement." He was quiet for a moment. She waited because she'd learned that his silences weren't empty. They were where he put the things that mattered most, the things that needed more space than words usually provided. And if you waited long enough, he generally found the words anyway. "I didn't ask for a partner," he said, "when I agreed to the arrangement. I asked for someone to satisfy the county requirement. That's all I thought I was getting." "That's all I thought I was giving," she said. "Yeah." The valley below them was going golden in the late light. Somewhere in the south pasture, the cattle moved with the slow, purposeful drift of animals that have everything they need. "What did we get instead?" she asked. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she felt the familiar impulse to fill the silence herself and suppressed it, because he deserved the space to say this in his own time, and she deserved to let him. "Something I don't have a word for," he said. "That's probably the most accurate thing I can tell you." She thought about that, about the two people who'd ridden in silence from Harlan Station to this ranch, two strangers bound by a document, both of them trying to survive the situation rather than each other. About how survival, when you do it long enough beside the same person, quietly becomes something else, without you noticing the exact moment it changes. "I have a word for it," she said. "What is it?" "Home," she said. "I think the word is home." He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He reached over and she took his hand, and they stood on the rise above the valley they had defended and built and defended again. And the light went long and gold across everything they'd made from nothing, and it was not perfect. It would never be perfect. There would always be another fence section heaving in the frost, another problem requiring documentation, another calculation to run, but it was real, which was better than perfect had ever been. The woman Calvin Mercer had sent west to fail was standing on 580 acres with 3 hired hands and a railroad contract and a building plan in her desk drawer, and she was not thinking about him at all. She was thinking about the East Wing, about the spring planting, about the conversation she needed to have with Alderton regarding a potential legal fund for other valley ranchers who might need it, about the look on Silas's face the first time their first quarter numbers had come back under the railroad contract, and he'd stood at the table and said 32%, like he was testing whether the number was real. She was thinking about how her mother had told her that a woman of quality was never visibly uncomfortable, and how she had been visibly uncomfortable, publicly and repeatedly, for 2 straight years, and how that had turned out to be not the disaster her mother feared, but the beginning of everything she'd built. She was thinking about the journal she'd kept, the 4 words she'd written on the train, somewhere past Providence, with the landscape going wild out the window. He underestimated me. Good. The valley held the light as long as it could. Then the shadow came down from the ridge, the way it always did, and they turned and walked back toward the lights of the house that was going to be larger by fall, and the cattle settled and the creek ran, and the night came down clean and cold and full of everything that was still ahead of them.